Shout out to Idaho State for making an interesting game from start to finish. For UNLV fans, that was pretty ugly to start the Dan Mullen era. This was a game that it just seemed like the Rebels can never get a rhythm and keep it going. A lot of question marks. I don't prefer the two quarterback system. I think Calandra looked more consistent. Alex Orji didn't really get the opportunity to do too much. It started off bad when they're driving down to score and he fumbles in the end zone and it's a touchback going the other way for the Bengals. This is a team that was hesitant to pass the ball, but Jayden Thomas is definitely their guy. He's got to be the best running back in the conference, one of the best running backs in the country. When they hand him the ball, he can make plays pretty special. The defense was spotty. Bengals were lining up the secondary for most of the game, despite Idaho State's quarterback throwing 4 picks. It's kind of deceptive because it seems like they're having their way pretty much the whole first half. They're running the ball well. The middle linebackers were nowhere to be found. Diving into this game, through the first quarter, UNLV was just looking a complete mess. Went down 10-0. Finally scored with Jayden Thomas. I think Jayden Thomas had 3 touchdowns through the first half. He came up big for them. I would have to say, inconsistencies and, lack of discipline was the highlight for UNLV. Their home opener against, Idaho State, who they clearly really weren't prepared for, and I don't think they're expecting Coach, Cody Hawkins to do some trickery and catch them off guard, and it worked well for the Bengals through most of the game. Clearly, there was a skill, athleticism disadvantage for the Bengals, but they found a way to overcome it and really had UNLV on the ropes for pretty much the whole game. The Bengals threw 3-4 picks, and UNLV just couldn't really keep themselves above water for most of the game. They would make a good play, and then they would get a taunting penalty going for them, and 15-yard penalty kept the drive going for the Bengals. UNLV missed a pair of field goals in this game. Defensively, just non-existent, and besides those, crucial turnovers that came at the right moment, which was great, they were getting shredded really in the secondary, and Brooks, the running back for the Bengals, he was able to have their way with them, for the most of, this third quarter, just driving. I say it again, 24-point dogs, and it ends up being a touchdown game through the final minutes of the fourth quarter. Overreactions for UNLV is this is a team that's nowhere near ready to challenge for a Mountain West title. This is a team that's going to lose, 3-4 games. This is a team that's probably not going to be ready to compete with Boise State. They may get, taken advantage of against UCLA. Quarterback struggles. They do have a running game, and they're going to have to rely on it way more than they did. I felt like they didn't really trust the quarterbacks to put it in their hands. These designed QB runs just weren't really working, and when they were, you could see that it was against an FCS school, and that's not going to be able to work against, the rest of the conference. Taking a breath and calming down and realizing this is the, first game of the season, first game under the Dan Mullen era. They have the talent, the skill set and everything. They're going to have to get going and figure out what they're about and how to win games. And I feel like Hopefully they don't rely on the 2 QB system very long and just go ahead and pick a guy and stick it out with him. This is a team that can be just as dangerous, but also, self-detrimental to what they're trying to accomplish. You can't have these taunting plays. You can't miss field goals. There were some questionable calls, of course. I think there was a drive when Idaho State was going down and the receiver caught it, but it looked like his foot was touched out of bounds. That was, they upheld that, and then the very next play, they give him a PI call, which a completely uncatchable ball ends up going for Idaho State, and they keep the drive going, and that's how they end up scoring. I feel like there was a lot of questionable calls against the UNLV, but at the same time, they should not be competing with Idaho State. It should be a blowout through the first, quarter, first half, and they kept them in it the entire game, and that's mostly on the Rebels' fault and coaching and figuring out how to limit the Bengals' possessions offensively. I believe UNLV's never going to look as bad as they did right here and now. The weeks to follow, they're going to be way more improved, and they're going to find themselves. Do we hold off on possibly spoilers against Boise State and playoff talks and Mountain West title hopes and all this? They will probably take a pause on it and reassess, take it game by game, get your offense really rolling. When in doubt, rely on Jayden Thomas to get you through those tough drives. Defensively, they're going to go back to the drawing board and try and figure out what went wrong so badly in week 0. 31-38, UNLV takes the win. Ugly, unfortunate way of doing it, but they get the win, they get the dub, and they move forward into the rest of the season. I wasn't really expecting a close game. I thought Fresno State would have been able to do a little bit more. After Kansas went down, scored in their first drive, Fresno State matched them. E.J. Warner looked pretty good. From there on out, there was really no more efficiency to be had for the Bulldogs. E.J. Warner finishes the game with 2 turnovers, 2 picks. Offensively, they could not get anything going. Kansas defensive line was at him all day. And, defensively, Fresno State could not stop Jalen Daniels, at all. He had a damn near perfect day. 3 touchdowns. We're talking about 18 for 20 throwing the ball and then running the ball. He had another nearly 50 yards running the ball. Kansas State just proved to be a way better team. A team ready to see their own success, get better in the Big 12. I want to say, Fresno State just was getting a brand new look, seeing what works and what doesn't work. They're a team with a lot of weaknesses early on, and I think they can tighten that up. But after their first drive where they looked pretty darn good, they could not do anything else. 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. Turnover. Kansas is a good football team, and Fresno State's can be a pretty good team going in the rest of the season. I think they still find a way to get to a bowl game, but looking at it, I was worried that Warner wasn't that mobile, and if he can't get the time he needs to look through his reads, that it's basically a blown play, and we've shown that Kansas was going at him and we're not giving him any room to breathe. Bryson Donaldson really could not get anything going. He only had 34 yards off 11 attempts. It was never really close. I don't think this is indicative of what Fresno State has going forward the rest of the season, but it was, ugly win or ugly loss for the Bulldogs to start the season. From here on out, I think we're going to be able to see more production from them. They're going to get a little bit of a break next week. They got Georgia Southern, who they shouldn't take lightly. That's a team that can run almost as well as Kansas and can give them fits. You got Oregon State. That's a tough matchup too. 2 games not to sleep on for the Bulldogs. I believe they will be better. They're going to have to figure out a little bit more. They're going to be more competitive the rest of the way of the season. It remains to be seen just how well E.J. Warner and the offense can get going. Defensively, they have to be better. But again, if your offense is going 3 and out, getting turnovers and on the wrong side of the field, the defense can only do so much. I think Fresno State rebounds next weekend. Has a good, impressive performance against Georgia Southern. They want to stick in games the rest of the way. They can't have that many turnovers. They can't have a fumble lost, a couple of picks. They need to rely on the running game a little bit more, and from there, find a way to get your offense going through the air. We have to wait and see if it's more of a offensive problem or defensive problem. It was just a bad execution all the way around for Fresno State, and hopefully they can improve off this blowout loss week 0. Talk about a crazy game. Impressive victory for Hawaii week 0 against Stanford. There's a little part of me in the beginning, and probably for most people watching, that felt that this game was going to get out of hand early, and the Rainbow Warriors came back and made it competitive and overcame some injuries and some circumstances, and got the dub to start the season. I know people were believing that Andrew Luck and his coach, Frank Reich, were going to have Stanford back to the old ways, and for a part they were, physical play. They were able to run the ball pretty well throughout for the most part. Passing the ball, they could not make a completion to save their life. They looked abysmal throwing the ball. I would say that the score isn't really indicative of how it really went about it. Stanford drove downfield, kicked a field goal, okay. First possession for Hawaii. The returner fair catches the ball, lets it bounce. Before doing so, they get the ball at the 1 yard line, 1 or 2 yard line, and Michael Alijado's first snap takes a sack, fumbles, scoop and score. 10 points easy. That Stanford's up. Now it's looking like it could get ugly. They have to figure out what's going on. But Michael Alijado, all the hype around him turns out to be quite true. He finds a way to drive it downfield, get a touchdown. Now it's 10-7. It's looking a little bit more manageable. When I say Stanford just did not look like their old selves, they just could not get anything going. They're physical and found a way to, edge their way to some first downs, but for the most part, they still have plenty of improvement to go on. Hawaii was able to get a pair of touchdowns before half, took the lead 14-13. Early on in the third quarter, on the Hawaii possession, Michael Alihado takes a hip drop tackle, gets roughed up on the play, has to go out for the remainder of the drive. The remainder of the drive ends up being a wash, punt the ball away. From there, Stanford gets a missed possession. Michael Alihado, who many people thought wasn't gonna come back into the game, comes back into the game immediately with a noticeable limp. He finds a way to drive them down. They score a field goal. Now they're up 17-13. Stanford finds a way to score. They take the lead 2017. Hawaii can only get so much going with Alihado. He's sort of overthrowing passes. He still has a noticeable limp. He's fighting through it. They get a missed possession. Stanford gets the ball, and it looks like they're driving down a score, and they get a huge interception going the other way. From there, they're able to kick a field goal, tie the game up. Stanford has another missed possession, and it's looking like this game's going to OT. Michael Alihado is able to, engineer an efficient drive. He goes, 50 yards downfield. They get into field goal range, and Japanese transfer kicker Matsuzama, he's able to get a chip shot in. Hawaii wins 23-20. They cover the spread. Just an impressive win. Alihado looks fantastic, fighting through an injury and really keeping his team in the game. Everything I was hoping Hawaii was going to be going into the season so far. Huge impressive win against Stanford. I know they're not the Stanford that they were, but they're still a Power 4 team. Still get blue chippers in. And just a great win for Timmy Chang to start the season. Great win for the Rainbow Warriors. I think this shows that they can stay in games and stick it out, and I wouldn't count them out the rest of the way. I believe they're going to have some more impressive wins along the season. What better way to get your first win at home? Week 0, all eyes on you. Fighting through some adversity. Just an impressive win for Hawaii to start the season.